February 23, 1945. The Ruhr River Valley, Germany. The darkness before dawn is not truly silent. Oberst Frieder Hartmann knows this now, standing in the concrete bunker that commands what remains of the 89th Infantry Division's defensive line, listening to sounds that do not belong in the night. There is the wind, carrying the smell of mud and cordite across the flooded river plain. There is the distant rumble that might be trucks or tanks, impossible to distinguish at this range. And there is something else, something that makes the coffee cup tremble against the map table, sending ripples across the cold liquid inside, a vibration in the earth itself, rhythmic and growing, like the heartbeat of something vast waking in the darkness. Hartmann is 52 years old, a veteran of the previous war who spent 4 years in trenches watching artillery shred men and earth with impartial efficiency. He had hoped never to stand on the receiving end of a prepared barrage again. He had hoped many things that February has proven foolish. Through the bunker's observation slit, he can see nothing but blackness punctuated by the occasional flare drifting down on its parachute, casting shadows that writhe across the cratered landscape like memories of the dead. His defensive line stretches for 8 kilometers along the high ground east of the Ruhr, dug into frozen earth, reinforced with concrete and steel and the labor of boys who should be in school. 3 weeks of work by engineers and infantry, 3 weeks of laying wire and sighting machine guns and registering mortar positions. It is, by the standards of this collapsing war, a competent defensive position. Hartmann has told himself this repeatedly, has walked the line and inspected the positions and assured his battalion commanders that they can hold here, that the Americans will bleed themselves white against prepared defenses, as attackers always do. But that tremor in the earth continues, and Hartmann, who learned to read vibrations in the ground at Verdun 27 years ago, knows with sick certainty what it means. Somewhere in the darkness across the river, in positions his reconnaissance patrols could not locate and his counter-battery fire could not suppress, the Americans are moving artillery into firing positions. Not a battery, not a battalion. The tremor speaks of something larger, something that makes his memories of Verdun feel quaint and small. He does not yet know that he is about to witness the orchestrated fury of 120 American artillery pieces, coordinated by radio and mathematics, and an industrial system that can place 10,000 shells on target with the precision of a surgeon and the violence of an earthquake. He does not yet understand that his defensive line, this position he has spent 3 weeks perfecting, will cease to exist as a military formation before the sun rises. The concept of massed artillery fire is not new to warfare. Napoleon understood that concentrated guns could shatter enemy formations. The German army itself had pioneered creeping barges and counter-battery techniques in the Great War, had written the doctrine on how artillery could win battles before infantry ever advanced. But what the Americans had done with artillery by February 1945 represented an evolution so complete it might as well have been a different weapon entirely. Where German artillery doctrine emphasized flexibility and responsiveness, guns positioned to support local commanders, firing missions coordinated at division level, American doctrine treated artillery as an industrial process that happened to involve explosives. The American system, refined through 2 years of combat from North Africa to the Rhine, operated on principles that German officers found alien and disturbing. Forward observers, often young lieutenants equipped with radios and training in trigonometry, could call fire missions that would be answered not just by their supporting battalion, but by every gun in range regardless of unit assignment. Fire direction centers, coordinating through radio nets and standardized procedures, could mass the fire of multiple battalions onto a single target in minutes. Time on target calculations, ensuring that shells fired from guns at different ranges would all impact simultaneously, transformed artillery from a weapon that announced its presence with ranging shots into one that delivered catastrophic violence without warning. And behind all of this stood American industrial capacity, factories producing shells in quantities that made German ammunition expenditure look miserly, trucks delivering those shells to gun positions with assembly line regularity, replacement barrels and parts available whenever equipment wore out. The result was that by early 1945, an American corps preparing for an offensive could coordinate artillery fire with a sophistication and weight that no other army in history had achieved. The Germans called it Materialschlacht, material battle, and used the term as both explanation and excuse for their defeats. But the term missed something essential. This was not simply about having more guns and shells, though the Americans certainly had those. It was about transforming artillery from an art practiced by skilled gunners into a system operated by trained technicians, from a weapon commanded by officers exercising judgment into a tool directed by mathematics and industrial processes. Oberst Hartmann understood German artillery. He had commanded batteries in the Great War, had studied Bruchmüller's infiltration tactics, had written papers on counter-battery fire for the War Academy. What he did not understand, what no amount of study had prepared him for, was the American approach. Artillery as mass production, destruction as industrial output, violence delivered with the reliability of a factory producing automobiles. At 0442 hours, 3 minutes before the scheduled bombardment, the last German sentry on the forward slope of Hill 94 heard a sound that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. A freight train rushing through the sky overhead, multiplied 100 times, the air itself tearing apart from the passage of high-explosive shells. He had time to open his mouth, perhaps to scream a warning or curse God, or simply to equalize the pressure he knew was coming. And then the world became light and noise, and the earth rising up to meet him. The first salvo, 120 105mm and 155mm shells, arriving simultaneously after flight times calculated to the second, struck the German forward positions at precisely 0445 hours. The concept of time on target firing, which American artillery had developed to perfection, meant that there was no warning, no ranging shots, no opportunity to seek deeper cover. One moment, the German soldiers were standing watch, or sleeping in dugouts, or brewing coffee against the cold. The next moment, their world was being disassembled by high explosives arriving at the rate of 4 shells per second, every shell precisely positioned by forward observers and fire direction centers to achieve maximum destruction of specific targets: machine gun positions, communication trenches, mortar pits, bunkers, assembly areas. Inside his command bunker, Hartmann felt the first salvo as a physical blow, as if the concrete itself had been struck by a giant's fist. Dust rained from the ceiling. The electric lights flickered and died. The telephone connection to his forward battalions went dead mid-sentence, the line cut by shells that had been specifically targeted at communication nodes identified through aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogation. In the darkness broken only by emergency lanterns, Hartmann reached for the radio handset and found static, found electronic screaming that meant the radio antenna had been destroyed or the operator's position had ceased to exist. For 30 seconds, he stood frozen, a commander suddenly isolated from the battle he was supposed to control, and then training reasserted itself. He would go forward, would physically move to alternate command posts, would restore control through personal leadership as German doctrine demanded. He never made it out of the bunker. The bombardment that would continue for 47 minutes was just beginning. The mathematics of what was happening to Hartmann's defensive line can be expressed in stark numbers. 120 guns, each capable of firing 4 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, actually maintaining a sustained rate of 2 rounds per minute, generating 240 shells per minute, 14,400 shells across the bombardment's duration. Not fired randomly, but plotted systematically. The first phase targeting forward positions and observation posts. The second phase walking back across communication trenches and supply routes. The third phase concentrating on predetermined strong points and reserve positions. The Americans called it time on target concentration, a sequential destruction of a defensive system planned to ensure that each position was hit when it was most vulnerable and least able to receive support. German doctrine had always emphasized the importance of deep, layered defenses precisely to avoid catastrophic destruction from artillery. Hartmann's positions were not linear, but checkerboard, with forward outposts supported by main defensive positions supported by reserve battalions. On paper, the destruction of forward positions should have triggered planned withdrawals to secondary lines, while reserve units counterattacked to restore the position. But doctrine assumed communication, assumed that orders could be transmitted and units could coordinate and commanders could assess the situation and make decisions. The American barrage had been planned specifically to prevent this. Communication centers identified through signal intelligence were hit in the first minutes. Roads and trails leading to reserve positions were saturated with interdiction fire. Even the location of Hartmann's command bunker, precisely identified through analysis of radio transmissions and the testimony of deserters, received special attention. 3,155mm shells impacting in a 50-meter radius. Not enough to destroy the reinforced concrete, but more than enough to collapse the entrance trenches, sever all communication lines, and ensure that the command staff was trapped underground while their positions disintegrated above them. By 0500 hours, 15 minutes into the bombardment, Hartmann's defensive line had effectively ceased to exist as a coordinated military force. Individual positions still held soldiers who were alive, machine guns that still functioned, officers who tried to maintain discipline and prepare to resist the infantry assault they knew must be coming. But these were isolated fragments, each fighting its own battle without knowledge of what was happening 50 meters away, without communication with higher command, without any possibility of coordinated response. The defensive system that Hartmann had spent 3 weeks preparing had been reduced to rubble and shock and isolated strongpoints in less time than it took to eat breakfast. Lieutenant Hans Weber, commanding a platoon in one of those surviving positions, crouched in a bunker that shook like a living thing with each near miss, and tried to understand what was happening. He was 23 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had survived Kursk and the retreat through Ukraine, who thought he understood what artillery could do. He had been shelled by Soviet batteries that fired until their tubes glowed red, had endured bombardments that seemed to last forever. But this was different. The Soviet barges had been massive but crude, thousands of shells fired in the general direction of German positions, achieving destruction through sheer volume. This American fire was surgical. Shells landed on positions, not near them. Machine gun nests that had been carefully camouflaged were obliterated by direct hits. Mortar positions received attention from counter-battery fire minutes after they attempted to return fire, as if the Americans had eyes that could see through smoke and darkness. What Weber could not know was that they did. American counter-battery radar, refined through years of development and deployed at every divisional fire direction center, could detect the muzzle flash and trajectory of enemy artillery and calculate its position within seconds. American aerial observers in liaison aircraft could circle beyond the range of German anti-aircraft fire and direct artillery onto targets with precision that seemed supernatural to soldiers who thought of air support as random bombing. American forward observers, equipped with radios whose reliability German signals officers would have considered impossible, maintained constant communication with fire direction centers that treated their target requests as work orders to be fulfilled with industrial efficiency. The symbolic object that would come to represent this experience for the Germans who survived, it was not a weapon, but a sound. The whistle of incoming shells, multiplied into a continuous shriek that seemed less like an auditory phenomenon than a physical presence, a pressure in the air that made breathing difficult and thinking impossible. German veterans of the Eastern Front had learned to distinguish between the sounds of different calibers, could estimate from the whistle whether a shell would land close enough to matter. But the American bombardment offered no such discrimination. The shells came continuously, in salvos timed to prevent any period of safety, in mixtures of calibers that made prediction impossible. The sound became everything, drowning out orders and prayers and the screams of the wounded, reducing human consciousness to an animal state where there was only the noise and the waiting for it to stop. At 0532 hours, 47 minutes into the bombardment, the American guns fell silent with a synchronization that was itself unnerving. German survivors, their hearing damaged and their nerves shattered, had perhaps 30 seconds of relative quiet before the next phase began. Mortars firing smoke to blind the surviving positions, machine guns opening up to suppress any movement. and American infantry rising from their assembly positions to advance across ground that had been mapped and rehearsed until every squad leader knew which crater to use for cover and which bunker was his unit's objective. Hartmann, finally escaping his buried bunker through an emergency exit that had partially collapsed, emerged into a landscape that seemed unfamiliar despite 3 weeks of daily inspection. The carefully prepared trench lines were gone, filled with dirt or collapsed entirely. The camouflaged bunkers that had been invisible from the air were now crater-ringed ruins, their positions marked by the precision of the fire they had received. The communication trenches that had allowed rapid movement between positions were impassable, blocked by rubble and unexploded shells and pieces of equipment too damaged to identify. And everywhere, the smell of explosive and churned earth and the things that happen to human bodies when they are caught by high-explosive shells. He tried to organize a defense, tried to gather the scattered survivors into some formation that could resist the American infantry he could hear advancing through the smoke. But there was nothing to organize. The soldiers who staggered toward him were beyond command, their faces blank with shock, their responses mechanical. The officers who should have been rallying their units were dead or trapped or simply missing, swallowed by a bombardment that had been specifically designed to destroy the chain of command. Hartmann, trained in a military tradition that emphasized leadership and personal courage and the triumph of will over circumstance, discovered that none of these things mattered when the fundamental structure of military organization had been shattered by systematically applied violence. The Americans who advanced through the smoke that morning found resistance, but it was fragmentary and disorganized. Individual machine gun positions that had survived the bombardment would fire until they were flanked and overrun. Small groups of German soldiers would surrender as soon as American infantry appeared, grateful to escape the artillery that might resume at any moment. Officers like Hartmann, trying desperately to establish some defensive line, found themselves commanding ghost units, positions that existed on their maps but consisted of empty holes in the ground. By 0800 hours, 3 hours and 15 minutes after the bombardment began, American infantry had secured all objectives. Hartmann's 8-kilometer defensive line, 3 weeks in the making, had been overrun with American casualties so light they barely merited mention in the after-action reports. The German prisoners, shell-shocked and docile, were more grateful for the silence than resentful of their capture. They had expected to fight Americans who were brave but inexperienced, who would attack with determination but without sophistication. They had prepared to sell their positions dearly, to exact casualties that would slow the American advance, and buy time for Germany to negotiate some kind of armistice that preserved something of the Reich. Instead, they had experienced industrial warfare perfected to a degree their doctrine had not imagined possible. They had learned that American infantry was merely the exploitation force for an artillery system that could destroy defensive positions with mechanical efficiency. They had discovered that the gap between American material superiority and German tactical skill was not something that courage or determination could bridge, because the Americans had transformed warfare from a contest of wills into a production process, where destruction was measured in tons per minute and success was calculated with slide rules and logarithm tables. The documents preserved in the U.S. Army's Artillery School Library tell this story in the dry language of after-action reports and fire mission logs. The first U.S. Army's artillery operation for the Roer River crossing involved 1,467 tubes from 105mm howitzers to 8-inch guns, firing over 45,000 shells in the initial bombardment phase. The coordination required to prevent fratricidal fire, to ensure that shells from dozens of different battalions all impacted on target without hitting advancing American infantry, involved mathematical calculations performed by fire direction centers using mechanical calculators and standardized procedures. The forward observers who directed this fire were junior officers, many of them barely older than the German soldiers they were destroying, operating according to training that emphasized precision and discipline over improvisation. The Germans had no equivalent system, not because they lacked skilled artillerymen or understanding of fire direction, but because their military culture emphasized flexibility over standardization, individual judgment over systematic procedures. German artillery officers were trained to assess situations and make decisions, to exercise the tactical intelligence that Prussian military tradition valued above all else. American artillery officers were trained to follow procedures, to input numbers into formulas, to trust the system rather than their intuition. In the context of World War II, where resources and industrial capacity determined outcomes more than individual brilliance, the American approach proved devastatingly superior. For Oberst Hartmann, sitting in a prisoner of war processing center that evening, the experience of watching his defensive line erased by artillery represented something beyond military defeat. He had spent his adult life in service to German military excellence, had believed in the superiority of German arms and training and tactical doctrine. The Eastern Front had shaken that belief, had shown that numerical superiority could overcome technical advantages. But even then he had maintained faith that German tactical skill could compensate for material deficiencies. The American artillery bombardment had destroyed that faith completely. There had been no tactical response to what he had experienced, no clever maneuver or brave stand that could have changed the outcome. His defensive line had been processed by a system that treated war as an engineering problem, and the system had worked with merciless efficiency. The recurring sound of the incoming shells, that freight train shriek multiplied 100 times, would follow him into civilian life after the war. He would hear it in thunderstorms, in the sound of heavy trucks on autobahns, in the industrial machinery of the rebuilt Germany. It became a symbol for something larger than artillery. The sound of American industrial capacity turned to military purposes, the noise of democracy fighting total war with systematic efficiency, the shriek of an ideology meeting reality and being found obsolete. What made the experience particularly devastating for German officers of Hartmann's generation was the contrast between expectation and reality. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft, undisciplined, their army a mob of individualists who lacked the cohesion and martial spirit of German soldiers. The stereotype of the American GI emphasized his dependence on material comforts, his inability to endure hardship, his lack of military tradition. German doctrine assumed that American infantry, while dangerous due to their firepower, could be defeated by superior German tactics and the superior will of soldiers fighting for their homeland. The artillery bombardment that erased Hartmann's defensive line demonstrated the fatal flaw in this thinking. The Americans had never intended to win through individual superiority or martial spirit. They had approached war as they approached industrial production, as a problem to be solved through systematic application of resources and standardized procedures. The artillery system that destroyed German positions was not operated by warriors in the German sense, but by technicians following protocols, by forward observers reading from field manuals, by fire direction officers using mechanical calculators to solve equations. There was no mystique, no martial tradition, just ruthless efficiency and a mathematical certainty that X tons of high explosive applied to Y square meters of terrain would produce Z percentage of casualties and structural destruction. This was democracy at war, and it was far more terrible than Nazi ideology had prepared the Wehrmacht to face. Not because American soldiers were Superman, but because American society had proven capable of organizing its vast industrial and human resources into a military machine that operated with the reliability of a factory and the violence of a hurricane. German tactical excellence, which had carried the Wehrmacht to the gates of Moscow and the shores of Egypt, meant nothing when faced with an enemy who could coordinate 120 guns to fire 14,000 shells in 47 minutes with precision that made German counter-battery fire look like guesswork. The psychological impact on German survivors of such bombardments rippled through the Wehrmacht's remaining forces in the war's final months. Soldiers who experienced American artillery learned to fear it more than direct combat, more than tanks, more than air attack. The randomness of the earlier war, where shells might land anywhere and survival was partially a matter of luck, had been replaced by targeting so precise it felt personal, as if the Americans could see into German positions and choose to destroy each one individually. Defensive positions that might have resisted for days in earlier campaigns were abandoned after hours of bombardment, their defenders psychologically shattered even if physically intact. The after-action reports filed by American artillery battalions from this period are remarkable for their matter-of-fact tone. The erasure of Hartmann's defensive line merited a few paragraphs in the First Army's daily summary, noting ammunition expended and targets destroyed with the same bureaucratic precision as a factory's production report. To the American officers coordinating the fire, this was simply the execution of a planned operation, the application of doctrine refined through years of practice. They had calculated the number of shells required to achieve specific effects, had distributed fire missions according to standardized procedures, had verified results through aerial observation and post-strike reconnaissance. That German officers found the experience traumatic was noted mainly as evidence of operational success. This gap in perception between American artillery as a technical operation and German experience of it as catastrophic trauma reveals something fundamental about the nature of the war's final phase. The Americans were fighting to end the war as quickly and efficiently as possible, treating each operation as a problem to be solved with available resources. The Germans were fighting for survival, for their homeland, for some vision of redemption or revenge that might justify the catastrophe Nazism had brought upon them. The mismatch between these purposes, combined with the vast disparity in material resources, produced encounters like the Roer River bombardment, moments where German soldiers discovered that their cause was not merely wrong but futile, that American industrial capacity translated into military capabilities so overwhelming that courage and skill became irrelevant. The symbolic power of the American artillery bombardment extended beyond its immediate tactical effects. To German soldiers and officers alike, those 120 guns represented everything Nazi ideology had denied about the democracies: that free societies could mobilize for total war, that industrial economies could be harnessed for military purposes, that citizen soldiers following standardized procedures could defeat professional armies steeped in martial tradition. The shells raining down on Hartmann's positions were not merely explosives, but arguments, each impact a refutation of the racial theories and militaristic myths that had justified Nazi aggression. In the prisoner of war camps, where German officers were confined after capture, discussions of American artillery capabilities took on an almost obsessive quality. Men who had survived the bombardments tried to explain to those who had not what it felt like to be on the receiving end of such systematized violence, to watch prepared positions disintegrate under fire so precise and overwhelming that defense became meaningless. Some clung to the belief that German forces might have prevailed with equal resources, that the outcome was merely a matter of numbers. Others, like Hartmann, recognized that something more fundamental had been demonstrated, that the American way of war, bureaucratic and industrial and seemingly soulless, was in fact more effective than the German approach that emphasized individual excellence and tactical brilliance. The liberation of the concentration camps in the weeks following the Roer River crossing added a moral dimension that made these tactical reflections unbearable for some German officers. The systematic efficiency they had experienced in American artillery fire, the careful calculation of destruction, the precise coordination of violence, echoed in horrifying ways the systematic efficiency with which the Nazi regime had murdered millions. The difference, which some German prisoners began to articulate in the quiet conversations of their confinement, was that American artillery destroyed military targets to end a war of aggression, while Nazi death camps murdered civilians to fulfill an ideology of hatred. Both systems demonstrated what industrial societies could achieve when organized towards systematic purposes, but the purposes themselves revealed everything about the nature of the regimes directing them. As dawn finally broke over the Roer River Valley on February 23, 1945, American infantry was already miles beyond Hartmann's obliterated defensive line, advancing toward objectives that German doctrine said should have taken weeks to reach. The artillery battalions that had delivered the bombardment were displacing forward, their guns hitched to trucks, their ammunition trucks already being resupplied from dumps that seemed inexhaustible. By evening, they would be in new positions, ready to repeat the performance against the next German defensive line. The system operated with mechanical reliability, each piece performing its function, the whole achieving effects that no single component could accomplish. For the Germans who survived that bombardment, the memory became a dividing line between before and after, between the war they thought they were fighting and the reality they had been forced to confront. Before, there had been tactical options, strategic possibilities, some path to an outcome that preserved something of Germany. After, there was only the recognition that they were being systematically destroyed by an enemy whose advantages were so overwhelming that resistance merely prolonged suffering without altering the outcome. The sound of those 120 guns, the freight train's shriek of shells in flight, became a symbol that encapsulated this recognition. It was the sound of American industrial might turned to military purposes, of democracy proving itself capable of organized violence on a scale that tyranny could not match. It was the sound of German military excellence being rendered obsolete, of tactical skill becoming irrelevant in the face of systematic superiority. It was the sound of a worldview collapsing, of certainties dissolving, of the future arriving with high explosive shells that cared nothing for tradition or courage or the myths men told themselves to make war meaningful. In the end, the story of German officers watching American artillery erase their defensive line is a story about the death of illusions. It is about what happens when ideology collides with industrial reality, when martial mythology faces systematic efficiency, when soldiers trained to believe in their superiority discover they are merely targets being processed by a system that operates beyond their comprehension or resistance. Oberst Hartmann, standing in the ruins of his defensive line as American infantry advanced through the smoke, understood finally that the war had been lost not in that moment, but years earlier, when Nazi leadership chose to fight enemies whose industrial capacity and organizational sophistication they could not begin to match. The American artillery that erased that defensive line before dawn was not merely a weapon, but a statement, a demonstration of what free societies could accomplish when their survival required it. The 120 guns spoke with a single coordinated voice, and what they said was this: that democracy can fight total war with efficiency that dictatorship cannot match, that industrial society organized for military purposes produces capabilities that tactical brilliance cannot overcome, that the future belongs not to those who worship strength, but to those who understand systems. It was a lesson purchased with German blood and terror, taught by American shells arriving with mathematical precision, learned in bunkers that shook like the earth itself was rejecting the army that occupied it. The freight train's shriek of incoming shells faded with the sunrise, but its echo would follow Germany into a future where the nation would have to rebuild not just cities and industries, but fundamental assumptions about itself and its place in the world. That sound, multiplied 120 times across 47 minutes of systematic destruction, was the sound of one era ending and another beginning. The percussion marking history's rhythm as it moved forward, as it always does, over the ruins of empires that believed themselves eternal.